My daughter caused $30,000 of property damage, and I'll gladly pay every penny. My wife and I got home from work to find 2 police cars in my driveway and my 15-year-old Yolanda sitting on our porch steps with her head bowed, sawdust in her hair. Next door, the damage was catastrophic. What had been a magnificent 20-foot Japanese maple imported from Kyoto now lay in pieces across our neighbor Daniel's manicured lawn. Yolanda had taken my chainsaw to it, and she'd been thorough. The trunk was cut into sections, branches scattered everywhere. 30 years of growth destroyed in minutes. Daniel was screaming at the officers about pressing charges. That tree was worth $30,000. She's a vandal. I want her arrested. Yolanda, what the hell happened? I asked, my stomach sinking as I looked at the destruction. She looked up at me with steady eyes, sawdust still clinging to her dark hair. I had to cut it down, Dad. You had to? I stared at her in disbelief, while my wife Linda started to cry. You destroyed their property. This is a felony. Daniel stormed over, his face purple with rage. Your daughter is psychotic. That tree was worth more than your house. The officer stepped between us and said we needed to discuss this calmly. Linda grabbed Yolanda's shoulders, checking her for injuries. Always the protective mother, even when our kid had clearly lost her mind. Yolanda, explain yourself right now, I said, trying to keep my voice level. She stood up slowly, and I noticed her hands were shaking despite her calm face. She looked at Daniel and said, I had to get rid of that tree, because you've been climbing it to watch me through my bedroom window while I'm changing. The entire scene went silent. Daniel's face went from purple to white in seconds. That's a disgusting lie, he sputtered. She's making things up to avoid consequences. Yolanda pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and showed us a video. The quality was grainy, but clear enough to see a figure in the tree outside her second-story window. I've been recording for weeks because I knew no one would believe me. Look at the timestamp. This was Tuesday at 11 p.m. while I was getting ready for bed. My blood started to heat up as I watched the footage. Linda's hand went to her mouth. That could be anyone, Daniel said quickly, his voice climbing higher. Kids climb trees all the time. Maybe it was someone else's teenager pulling pranks. You have that class ring you never take off, Yolanda said quietly. You can see it in the video where you're holding the branch. I looked closer at the footage and could see the distinctive ring glinting in the moonlight. The same ring Daniel was wearing right now. I was reeling, hating that my daughter thought she'd need proof before she could tell us she was being violated, when she said something that hit like a hammer. But that's not even why I had cut it down. Her voice cracked for the first time and she said, Last night I woke up at 2 a.m. and he was in my room. The world tilted. I felt Linda's sharp intake of breath beside me. The officer's hand moved to his radio. She's lying, Daniel shouted, but he was backing away now. I've never been in your house. Yolanda's voice was barely a whisper, but every word was clear. You came through my window. You stood at the foot of my bed watching me. When I pretended to still be asleep, you walked around my room touching my things. You touched my diary on my desk. You went through my clothes in the hamper. You stood over me breathing like a serial killer. Her voice broke completely. I was so scared I couldn't move. I just lay there praying you would leave. I started moving toward Daniel, but the officer held me back. My hands were shaking with rage I'd never felt before. Yolanda held up her phone again, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. I have a recording app that activates with motion detection. I installed it 3 weeks ago when the watching started. She showed the officer her screen. Here's him climbing through my window. Here's him in my room standing over my bed. The officer's face went hard as he watched. He immediately called for backup. Daniel was still spouting bullshit. It's not what it seems, he begged. I was just checking because she leaves her window unlocked and I was worried about security for the neighborhood. You were in my daughter's room? I roared, breaking free from the officer's grip. You were watching her change? She's 15 years old. Linda was crying now, holding Yolanda, who stood there still and brave but shaking like a leaf. My baby girl had to sleep knowing you were watching her. She had to see you at neighborhood barbecues knowing what you were doing. She had to live in fear in her own room. The tree was the only way he could reach my window, Yolanda said, tears finally falling. I tried putting up curtains, but he got angles around them. I tried telling Mom last week I didn't want her to be upset. Every night I'd lie awake watching that tree, waiting to see his shadow. After last night when he was in my room, I knew he'd come back. I knew he'd do something worse next time. The tree had to go. The officer was now reading Daniel his rights while calling for additional units. Daniel was stammering about misunderstandings and property damage, but his wife had already gone inside, presumably to pack. I pulled Yolanda into the tightest hug of her life, feeling her shake against me. I'll cut down every tree in this neighborhood if it keeps you safe. I'm sorry about the tree, Dad, she whispered into my chest. I know it was expensive, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. Don't you dare apologize, I said fiercely. You protected yourself when we failed to notice. I'm so proud of you. That's when Daniel broke free and lunged toward us. The officers reacted fast, slamming into Daniel before he got 3 steps. They brought him down hard onto the grass, right where sawdust from his precious tree was still scattered everywhere. His face pressed into the dirt, while one officer put a knee on his back and the other grabbed his arms. I pulled Yolanda behind me, feeling her whole body shake against my back while Linda wrapped her arms around both of us. Daniel was screaming into the ground about lawsuits and lies, but the officers weren't listening anymore. They yanked his arms back, and I heard the metallic click of handcuffs going on. The officer who'd been watching the videos stood up and carefully took Yolanda's phone from her trembling hand. He pulled out an evidence bag from his belt and sealed the phone inside, writing something on the label with a black marker. He told us this was crucial evidence, and he'd start the chain of custody right now to make sure nothing happened to it. Linda's fingers dug into my arm so hard I knew I'd have bruises later. While they hauled Daniel to his feet, I asked the officers about getting a protective order immediately. The younger one explained we'd have to go to the courthouse first thing in the morning, but they'd put extra patrols on our street tonight. I wanted to argue that wasn't enough, that this monster had been in my daughter's bedroom, but the officer just repeated it was the best they could do right now. They started dragging Daniel toward the patrol car, and he was still yelling that we were making everything up, that he'd sue us for every penny we had. His wife appeared in their doorway for maybe 5 seconds, looked at the scene, then went back inside and closed the door. I noticed curtains moving in windows all down the street, and a few neighbors standing in their driveways watching everything unfold. The officers shoved Daniel into the back of the patrol car, having to push his head down when he tried to resist. I turned to Yolanda and told her I'd pay every single penny for that tree if it meant keeping her safe. She finally broke then, sobbing into my chest and apologizing over and over about the tree and the money. I held her tight and told her she was the bravest person I'd ever known, that she protected herself when we failed to see what was happening. The officer with the clipboard came over and said he needed to take our statements, while everything was fresh. We sat on the porch steps while Yolanda explained how she downloaded the motion detection app 3 weeks ago after she first noticed someone outside her window at night. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see her hands shaking, so bad she could barely hold them still in her lap. The officer asked detailed questions about dates and times while writing everything down. He showed me his tablet, with the video paused, and I could see Daniel's college ring clear as day, the one he always bragged about from his football days at State. The same ring glinting on his hand right now as he sat in the back of that patrol car. My stomach churned thinking about him using that ring to pry open my daughter's window. The officer strongly recommended Yolanda not sleep in her room tonight, saying we should secure it better before she goes back in there. We decided to set up sleeping bags and pillows on our bedroom floor so all 3 of us could stay together. Linda gathered blankets while I helped Yolanda get her stuff from her room, neither of us looking at the window. That night, none of us slept much, but at least we were together. Yolanda between us on the floor like when she was little and had nightmares. The next morning we drove to the police station, where I had to sign a bunch of forms to officially release the phone as evidence. The detective explained they'd pull all the metadata from the recordings, which would show exact timestamps down to the second of when Daniel was in our house. She said this kind of digital evidence was nearly impossible to dispute in court, because the data doesn't lie. While we waited in the lobby for more paperwork, Yolanda started breathing too fast and her face went pale. I quickly looked up a grounding exercise on my phone and walked her through it, having her name 5 things she could see in the waiting room. Then 4 things she could touch like the plastic chair and her jeans. Then 3 things she could hear like the typing and phone ringing. It helped a little, gave her something to focus on besides the fear that was eating at all of us. Back in the car, Linda broke down completely and started talking fast about how Yolanda had tried to tell her something last week, but she'd brushed it off as teenage mood swings. She kept saying Yolanda had asked if they could move her room to the guest room, and Linda had said no because it was too much work. I remembered Yolanda asking me to help her move her dresser to block the window, and I told her I was too busy with the Henderson project at work. We sat there in the police station parking lot, feeling like the worst parents in the world, while Yolanda stared out the window, saying nothing. The drive home was silent, except for Linda's sniffling, and when we pulled into the driveway, I couldn't even look at Daniel's house next door. Inside, I went straight to Yolanda's room and started checking her window while she and Linda waited in the hallway. The latch had a fresh scratch mark right where someone would pry it with something small and metal. I took pictures with my phone from every angle and noticed the wood frame was slightly bent too. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the phone steady. I called our insurance company right there standing in her violated room and explained about the tree. The agent listened to everything, then said civil liability was separate from criminal charges and we'd probably still owe for the tree even if Daniel went to jail. She sounded sorry, but said their hands were tied by policy terms and suggested we get a lawyer. I hung up feeling sick about the money, but knowing I'd pay 10 times that to keep Yolanda safe. Our neighbor from across the street knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay because she'd seen the police cars. When I explained what happened, her face went white and she said her Ring doorbell faced Daniel's yard. She offered to check the footage from the past few weeks and share anything she found with the police. It was the first good news we'd had all day, and I thanked her probably 5 times before she left. I called Yolanda's school next and got transferred to the principal, who listened quietly while I explained the situation. He promised to keep everything confidential and said Yolanda could do remote learning if she needed to stay home for a while. He also said the school counselor could meet with her whenever she felt ready. At least she wouldn't have to face questions from classmates right away. I walked back outside and stood looking at the destroyed maple, with sawdust still scattered everywhere across Daniel's perfect lawn. Some neighbors were already whispering and pointing from their driveways, and I decided right then I didn't care what any of them thought. If they wanted to judge us for protecting our daughter, they could go to hell. I'd own this publicly and deal with whatever came next. 2 days later, Detective Maxine Cooper called and introduced herself as the lead investigator taking over the case. She scheduled Yolanda for an interview at something called the Child Advocacy Center, which she explained was a safe space designed for young victims. She said they had trained specialists who knew how to handle these cases and that everything would be recorded properly for court. Her confidence and professionalism made me feel like someone competent was finally in charge of this mess. The next morning, we drove to the courthouse to file for an emergency protective order, and the judge signed a temporary no-contact order right away. It was just a piece of paper, but having Daniel legally required to stay away felt like we were getting some control back. Linda put a copy in her purse and I folded one up for my car, and we both felt a tiny bit safer. That afternoon, Assistant DA Cecilia Ramos called to explain the charges they were considering against Daniel. She listed unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass and said they were looking at possibly adding burglary charges too. She warned us that proving intent beyond reasonable doubt would be challenging, but said the video evidence was really strong. She sounded sharp and determined, which gave me hope Daniel would actually face consequences. We found a therapist named Aditya Sutton, who specialized in trauma treatment for teenagers, and got Yolanda an appointment that same week. He met with all three of us first to understand what was going on with our family, then worked with Yolanda alone for an hour. When she came out, she seemed calmer and said she liked him, which was the first positive sign we'd had in days. The whole thing was moving so fast, but at least we were doing something instead of just sitting around feeling helpless. 3 days later, I was pulling into our driveway after work when I saw Daniel's silver Honda back in his driveway, and my whole body went cold. The cops had warned us he might make bail, but seeing him actually back next door made my skin crawl. I could see the black ankle monitor on his leg when he walked from his car to his front door, keeping his head down and moving fast. Linda called me from inside the house telling me Yolanda had locked herself in the bathroom when she saw his car pull up and wouldn't come out. I found her sitting on the bathroom floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, shaking. She wouldn't even look toward their house for the rest of the week. The cops increased their patrols like they promised, and I saw squad cars drive by every few hours, but it didn't make any of us feel safer knowing that creep was just 50 feet away. My phone started blowing up that night with messages from our HOA group chat, where everyone was losing their minds about the tree. Someone had posted photos of the destruction, and people were going nuts speculating about what happened. I typed out a short message saying it was a safety issue related to an ongoing police investigation, and left it at that. Half the neighbors replied with support saying they trusted us and knew we wouldn't destroy property without good reason. The other half called us vandals and said we should pay for the damage immediately. One guy 3 houses down said we were setting a dangerous precedent, and what if everyone started cutting down trees they didn't like? I wanted to tell them all exactly what Daniel did, but the detective had told us not to discuss details publicly yet. The next morning, a truck from Safeguard Security pulled up and started installing cameras on every corner of our house. We got the full package with night vision, motion sensors, and alerts that went straight to our phones. The guy spent 6 hours mounting cameras to cover every possible angle around the property. Then he installed motion lights that would blind anyone who came near the house after dark. The last thing was window bars on Yolanda's room that locked from the inside. She picked a decorative pattern that didn't look too much like a prison, but we all knew what they were for. The house looked like a fortress when they finished, and the installer said we had better coverage than most banks. It was both reassuring and depressing that this is what it took for my daughter to feel safe sleeping in her own home. That night, Linda and I got into our first real fight about the whole thing. She kept saying she should have noticed something was wrong when Yolanda mentioned feeling watched last month. I snapped back that I was working 60-hour weeks and barely saw either of them. We went back and forth blaming ourselves and each other, both of us defensive and guilty about missing the signs. Linda started crying, saying she failed as a mother, and I felt like garbage for making her feel worse. We finally stopped fighting and just held each other on the couch, both of us crying for what our daughter went through alone while we were oblivious. The neighbor across the street knocked on our door the next day, holding a USB drive. She said her Ring doorbell had a clear view of Daniel's yard, and she'd pulled footage from the past 2 months. I plugged it into my laptop right there on the porch, and my stomach turned watching the infrared night vision. There was Daniel at 12:47 a.m., climbing that tree like he'd done it 100 times before. The footage from another night showed him staying up there for over an hour, and you could see him looking straight at Yolanda's window. Detective Cooper came by to collect the USB and said this backed up Yolanda's timeline perfectly. She said the more evidence they had from different sources, the harder it would be for Daniel's lawyer to claim the videos were fake. 2 weeks later, Detective Cooper called with an update from the crime lab. The tech guys had gone through every frame of Yolanda's recordings and confirmed they were completely real with no editing or tampering. They pulled the metadata showing exact times and dates, even the GPS coordinates proving the videos were taken in Yolanda's room. She said Daniel's defense was falling apart fast, and his lawyer was already floating plea deals. The next day, Cecilia Ramos from the DA's office called to walk me through the charges. She sounded confident about unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass, but said the burglary charge would be harder to prove. She explained they'd need to show Daniel intended to commit a crime beyond just trespassing when he entered the room. Then she mentioned something that made my chest tight. She said they might offer a plea deal to avoid putting Yolanda through a trial. Part of me wanted Daniel to get the maximum punishment possible, But the thought of Yolanda having to testify, to relive everything in front of strangers, made me sick. I was still processing that when my phone rang from an unknown number. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Gary Temple, Daniel's defense attorney. He started talking fast about how this was all a misunderstanding between neighbors, and Daniel was just concerned about neighborhood security. He actually said Daniel was checking on our house because he cared about the community. I hung up on him mid-sentence and immediately called Cecilia to report the contact. She said to document everything and not engage with him again. 3 days later, an envelope arrived, certified mail, that made my hands shake with rage. It was a civil demand letter from Daniel's lawyer seeking $30,000 for the destroyed tree. This predator who violated my daughter wanted us to pay him. Linda had to physically grab my arm to stop me from walking next door and doing something stupid. I stood there in our kitchen holding that letter, shaking with fury that this monster thought he could intimidate us with legal threats after what he did. Cecilia called within an hour after I forwarded her the letter and told us not to respond or admit anything. She said criminal proceedings took priority, and any civil admission could mess up the criminal case. She promised the criminal conviction would help our defense in any civil case. I bit my tongue and followed her advice, even though every part of me wanted to tell Daniel's lawyer exactly where he could shove his demand letter. The next morning, I started moving Yolanda's stuff to the guest room on the other side of the house, as far from Daniel's property as we could get. She helped carry her clothes while I hauled her desk and bookshelf down the hall. The guest room had smaller windows that faced our backyard instead of his house. I spent the whole afternoon changing every lock in the house with new deadbolts from Home Depot. My hands were sore from using the screwdriver, but I needed to do something physical to burn off the rage. The locksmith came that evening to install security bars on the guest room windows that locked from inside. Yolanda tested them 3 times, making sure she could lock and unlock them herself. She stood in her new room looking around, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders weren't hunched up around her ears. She still checked the windows every few minutes, but at least she was breathing normal. 2 days later, Linda was home alone when someone knocked on our door. It was Daniel's wife, and Daniel's car wasn't in their driveway. Linda almost didn't let her in, but the woman looked broken. She sat at our kitchen table and told Linda she'd suspected something was wrong for months. She said Daniel had been acting strange, staying up late, making excuses to be outside at night. She thought maybe he was having an affair, but never imagined this. Her hands shook as she explained she was filing for divorce and moving to her sister's place in Ohio. She wanted Linda to know she believed Yolanda completely. She left after 10 minutes and Linda found her crying in her car before she drove away. That night I couldn't sleep, so I started writing in an old notebook, trying to remember every sign I'd missed. 3 weeks ago, Yolanda had asked if we could get blackout curtains. 2 months ago, she'd mentioned she wasn't sleeping well. Last semester, she'd started changing in the bathroom instead of her room. 6 months ago, she'd asked if we could move. Every memory felt like a punch to my gut. I wrote down the times she seemed nervous at dinner when Daniel would wave from his yard, the way she'd started doing homework in the living room instead of at her desk by the window, her sudden interest in staying at friends' houses on weekends. Page after page of things that should have been red flags, but I was too busy with work to notice. I promised myself I'd never ignore my family like that again. The guilt was eating me from the inside. The next week we met with Yolanda's school counselor, who set up something called a 504 plan. It let Yolanda leave class if she got triggered without getting marked absent. She could make up tests and homework from home when she needed to. The counselor was careful not to share details, but word got around that something serious had happened. Some kids started asking questions, but Yolanda's 3 best friends formed a wall around her at lunch and between classes. They walked her to her locker and sat with her in the library. She wasn't alone at the school anymore, which helped her feel safer. My boss called me into his office the following Monday to talk about all the time I'd been missing. Court dates, police meetings, therapy appointments were adding up. He said he understood family comes first, but the project deadlines weren't changing. I filed for FMLA leave that afternoon and switched to working from home 3 days a week. My performance reviews would take a hit and I'd probably lose out on the promotion I'd been working toward. None of that mattered anymore. Yolanda needed me present, and I wasn't going to fail her again. Detective Cooper called to say she was having the crime lab check for fingerprints on Yolanda's diary and dresser drawers. She'd put a rush on it because she wanted the case airtight. The tech dusted everything with black powder that got everywhere, but Yolanda didn't care about the mess. Cooper said even partial prints would help establish Daniel had touched things in the room. Her confidence made me think justice might actually happen. 3 days later, the results came back with a partial print from the diary that matched Daniel's prints from his arrest. The window latch expert came by that same week to examine the scratch marks I'd photographed. He measured them and took close-up pictures with special equipment. He said the pattern matched exactly what you'd see from someone using the edge of a thick ring to pry open the latch. He could tell from the angle and depth that it took real force, not something that could happen by accident. He'd testify to that in court if needed. Another piece of proof locked into place. During our next family session, Aditya taught us about trauma responses and how Yolanda's brain was trying to protect her. We learned that checking windows and not sleeping were normal reactions to what happened. He showed us how to recognize when she was getting triggered, like when her breathing got fast or she started picking at her fingers. We practiced grounding exercises together, counting things we could see and feel. He gave us a safety plan for panic attacks with specific steps to follow. Linda and I took notes like we were back in the school. It felt strange learning this new language, but it helped us understand what Yolanda was going through. We stopped telling her everything would be okay and started saying we were there with her. Small changes, but Aditya said they mattered. A week later, Ada Ramos called with an update about the case. She mentioned they might offer Daniel a plea deal that would make him register as a sex offender, but wouldn't require Yolanda to testify at trial. My first reaction was anger, because I wanted him to get the maximum punishment possible. But then I looked at Yolanda's face when Ramos explained she might not have to tell her story to a room full of strangers. The relief in her eyes was obvious. She'd been having nightmares about testifying, about Daniel's lawyer calling her a liar in court. Her healing mattered more than my need for revenge. I told Ramos we'd consider any deal that protected Yolanda from more trauma. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had split into two camps about the tree incident. Some people believed us and would stop Linda to offer support at the mailbox. Others thought we'd overreacted and let our kid destroy property over nothing. The HOA Facebook page turned into a war zone of arguments. Someone posted that we should pay for the tree and move if we couldn't control our child. Another person responded that they'd have done the same thing to protect their kid. I deleted Facebook completely and stayed off next door. Linda handled any neighborhood stuff we absolutely had to deal with. I focused on our family and let the gossips say whatever they wanted. 3 weeks later, we sat in the courtroom for the preliminary hearing, Linda gripping my hand while Yolanda stayed home with her aunt. The judge reviewed the evidence while Daniel's lawyer Gary Temple stood up arguing the recordings were obtained illegally. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and said, recording in your own bedroom for safety was completely legal. Temple tried again, saying the app wasn't properly registered, but the judge shut that down too. She found probable cause on all charges and set a trial date for 2 months out. Relief washed over me knowing Yolanda wouldn't have to testify today at least. The next week, Temple filed a formal motion to suppress all the app recordings. His argument was that Yolanda had no reasonable expectation to record someone entering her private space without consent. The paperwork made my head hurt with all the legal terms and case citations. Cecilia called us that night explaining she'd already prepared a counterbrief about self-defense documentation and how victims have every right to gather evidence of crimes against them. She faxed over her response, and it was 20 pages of solid legal arguments with precedents going back decades. I tried reading it but gave up after page 3. 2 days later, we were back in court for the protective order hearing. The temporary order was about to expire, and we needed something longer term. The judge reviewed Daniel's behavior since arrest and decided to issue a 2-year protective order with GPS monitoring. Daniel would have to wear an ankle bracelet that would alert police if he came within 500 feet of our house or Yolanda's school. The exclusion zones showed up on a map the court provided. It wasn't perfect protection, but seeing those red circles around our safe spaces helped. That weekend, the HOA called an emergency meeting about the tree incident. I walked in to find the room already divided with people literally sitting on opposite sides. The board president started asking about property damage and liability. I stood up and calmly stated there was an active criminal investigation with case number I provided. Some guy in the back yelled that we should pay first and sort out reasons later. A woman near the front said she'd cut down any tree if someone was using it to watch her kid. The arguing got louder and more personal. I walked out when someone suggested we were bad parents who should move. Linda stayed home with Yolanda, who couldn't handle facing the neighbors yet. The insurance adjuster came by Tuesday morning with his clipboard and camera. He spent 2 hours documenting the tree remains and taking measurements of sightlines to Yolanda's window. He pulled out a thick manual and showed me a section about property used in commission of crimes. Since the tree was essentially a tool for the stalking and break-in, we might have grounds to deny the claim. He took photos of the window latch scratch and copied the police report. He said if Daniel got convicted, it would strengthen our position significantly. Wednesday night, Linda discovered the online posts. Someone using a throwaway account was posting on local Facebook groups calling Yolanda a troubled teen who destroyed property and made up stories for attention. The posts included enough accurate details that it had to be someone close to the situation. I screenshot everything and sent it to Cecilia, who immediately documented it all and called Temple. She warned him that if his client was behind this, it could be witness tampering. The posts stopped within hours, but people had already seen them. Yolanda found out at the school when a classmate showed her one. Thursday afternoon, Cooper called with news from the crime lab. They'd found a partial print on Yolanda's diary that matched Daniel's prints from his arrest. It wasn't complete enough to use as primary evidence in court, but it supported everything else we had. She said between the videos, the doorbell footage, the window evidence, and now this print, the case was becoming overwhelming. Even if one piece got thrown out, the rest would stand. She sounded confident, which helped my anxiety slightly. Friday was rough because Yolanda had her first major panic attack at the school. She was walking to lunch when she saw someone from behind who looked like Daniel with the same build and hair color. Her breathing got fast and she started shaking uncontrollably. The counselor found her frozen in the hallway and helped her to the office. They used the grounding techniques Aditya taught her, counting things she could see and touch. After 20 minutes, she calmed down enough to call me. She was proud she'd handled it without completely melting down, even though she was embarrassed it happened. The school handled it perfectly, giving her space and not making a big deal. Monday morning, Cecilia called with big news. The prosecutor's office was ready to offer Daniel a plea deal. He would plead guilty to unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass, get 5 years probation with mandatory counseling, and have permanent no-contact orders. Most importantly, Yolanda wouldn't have to testify at trial. We had a family meeting that night to discuss it. Part of me wanted him to get the maximum sentence possible, to make him pay for every second of fear he caused. But then I looked at Yolanda's face when we explained she wouldn't have to tell her story to a room full of strangers and see Danielle staring at her. The relief in her eyes was obvious. She practically begged us to accept the deal. She said she just wanted it over, wanted to stop thinking about court dates and testimony. Tuesday brought another surprise when Temple sent a settlement proposal for the tree. They offered to reduce the damages if we paid $15,000 within 30 days and signed a non-disclosure agreement. My pride wanted to tell them to go to hell and fight it in civil court. But the practical part of me knew that ending everything cleanly might be worth some money. We countered with $8,000 and no NDA since the criminal case was public record anyway. Wednesday night, we sat around the kitchen table with Cecilia's plea offer spread out in front of us. Linda made coffee while I read through the terms again, watching Yolanda pick at her fingernails the way she did when she was nervous. The deal meant Daniel would plead guilty to unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass, get 5 years probation with mandatory counseling and permanent no-contact orders. No trial meant Yolanda wouldn't have to testify. I wanted him locked up for years, but when Yolanda looked up at me with those tired eyes and said she just wanted it over, the decision was made. The relief on her face when we agreed was worth more than any prison sentence. 2 weeks later, we drove to the courthouse for the plea hearing. Daniel stood there in his cheap suit, admitting to facts sufficient for conviction, while still claiming he was just concerned about neighborhood security. The judge asked if he understood he was giving up his right to trial, and he said yes. My jaw hurt from clenching my teeth so hard, but at least Yolanda didn't have to be there. The suppression motion his lawyer filed became moot with the plea, and that was one less thing to worry about. A month after that came sentencing. The courtroom was packed with neighbors who'd picked sides. Daniel got 5 years probation, mandatory sex offender treatment twice a week, electronic monitoring with a 9 p.m. curfew, and lifetime no-contact orders covering Yolanda, Linda, and me. The judge read out each condition slowly, while Daniel stood there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. It wasn't enough for what he did, but Yolanda wouldn't have to face him at trial, and that mattered more than my need for revenge. The judge turned to Daniel and warned him specifically about online harassment, saying she'd seen the anonymous posts that had appeared and disappeared. She looked right at him and said any violation of the order, any attempt to contact us directly or indirectly, would result in immediate incarceration for the full suspended sentence. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Within a week of sentencing, a for sale sign appeared in Daniel's yard. Yolanda noticed it first when she was getting off the school bus and actually smiled for the first time in weeks. 2 weeks after that, a moving truck showed up, and we watched from our living room window as they loaded boxes and furniture. Daniel never looked our way once, but his shoulders stayed hunched like he could feel us watching. The civil settlement paperwork arrived the next Monday. Gary Temple had agreed to our counteroffer of $8,000 with no admission of wrongdoing and no NDA. I wrote the check that afternoon, my hands steady, even though it hurt to give that monster any money. But I'd promised I'd pay for Yolanda's safety, and this was part of keeping that promise. The check cleared 3 days later, and the tree matter was officially closed. Thursday's therapy session with Aditya was different. He had Yolanda write a letter to Daniel that she'd never send, telling him exactly how he made her feel. She worked on it for the full hour, crying as she wrote. When she read parts to us in the family session afterward, her voice was strong even through the tears. She wrote about the fear of going to sleep, about checking her window 20 times a night, about feeling dirty in her own skin. She wrote about taking back her power with the chainsaw. Aditya said it was powerful progress. That same week, I sat down to write my victim impact statement for the court record. Even though there was no trial, the prosecutor said it would become part of the permanent file. I filled 8 pages describing how this predator violated our family, how my daughter had to gather evidence alone because she thought no one would believe her, how we failed to protect her when she needed us most. I wrote about the guilt that ate at me every day, about Linda crying in the shower where she thought we couldn't hear, about Yolanda's panic attacks and night terrors. I wrote until my hand cramped and then typed the rest. Linda and I started couples counseling the following Tuesday. The therapist's office was small and too warm, but we sat there working through our communication failures. We talked about the signs we missed, the times Yolanda tried to tell us something was wrong, the way we'd been too busy with work to really see our daughter struggling. We learned exercises for active listening and rebuilt trust that had cracked under the weight of guilt. Our marriage actually started getting stronger, like broken bones that heal thicker than before. At work, I finally told my boss the truth about what we were dealing with. I'd been making excuses for months about doctor appointments and family emergencies. When I explained about the criminal case and Yolanda's trauma, she immediately offered flexible scheduling and work-from-home options. I started delivering projects on time again and slowly rebuilt my reputation. The career hit was worth every missed meeting and deadline because Yolanda needed me present, and I wasn't going to fail her again. 2 weeks later, I drove Yolanda to her first self-defense class at the community center downtown. She'd found it online, a program specifically for teenage girls that focused on practical moves rather than martial arts competitions. The instructor was a woman in her 40s who'd been teaching for 20 years and understood trauma. Yolanda walked in nervous but came out sweating and smiling. She showed me the basic stance they'd learned, how to break a wrist grip, how to use her voice as a weapon. Every Thursday after that, I'd watch from the parent area as she practiced with other girls her age. She wasn't trying to become some action hero, just learning that her body had power. The way she stood straighter after each class made my chest tight with pride. A realtor called about showing Daniel's house to potential buyers, and I watched from our window as a young couple pulled up with a baby carrier. They looked nice enough, early 30s, the woman pointing at the yard while the man measured the driveway with his steps. I walked out to get the mail at the exact time they were leaving, gave them a quick nod and wave without stopping to chat. No oversharing about what happened, no suspicious staring, just normal neighbor behavior. They deserved to make their own impression of the neighborhood. When they moved in 3 weeks later, Linda baked them cookies and we introduced ourselves properly, keeping everything surface level and friendly. That Tuesday night was the first time in months that Yolanda slept straight through without waking up scared. Linda and I lay in our bed at 3 a.m., both awake out of habit, listening to the quiet house. No footsteps from Yolanda's room, no crying, no checking windows. Just the sound of our daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall. We held hands in the dark, neither of us wanting to jinx it by talking about it. The next morning, Yolanda came down for breakfast, looking rested for the first time since everything started. She didn't mention sleeping well, and neither did we, but we all knew something had shifted. I spent Saturday morning doing yard work, finally dealing with the spot where Daniel's maple used to stand. The chainsaw went into the garage storage, wrapped in canvas and pushed to the back where I wouldn't have to look at it. At the garden center, I bought 6 rose bushes with 2-inch thorns, the kind that would shred anyone trying to get through them. I planted them thick along the property line, creating a natural barrier that looked pretty, but would hurt like hell to climb through. The hardware store had motion sensor lights on sale, the kind that blast 1,000 lumens when triggered. I installed 3 of them, covering every angle of approach to Yolanda's window. The yard looked different now, less decorative and more defensive, but that was fine by me. Beauty meant nothing compared to safety. Friday night, we had our first real family dinner in forever, where nobody talked about lawyers or therapy or court dates. Yolanda pulled up videos on her phone of dogs doing stupid things, and we actually laughed. Really laughed. Not the forced kind we'd been doing. She showed us this one where a golden retriever kept trying to catch his own tail and falling over, and Linda snorted milk through her nose. We ordered pizza and ate it straight from the box, Yolanda stealing Linda's pepperoni like always. For 1 whole hour, we were just us again, not victims or witnesses or clients. Nobody mentioned Daniel's name or looked toward his old house or jumped when a car drove by. We were just a family eating pizza and watching dumb videos, and it felt like the best night we'd had in months. Monday morning, the bank showed the settlement check had cleared, $8,000 gone from our savings to pay for that damn tree. I looked at the balance and felt nothing but relief. $8,000 to end this nightmare, to never have to see Daniel in court again, to let Yolanda move forward without testimony. I'd pay it 10 times over. I adjusted our budget spreadsheet, moved some money from vacation savings to cover the gap, and closed the banking app. Worth every penny to buy our daughter's peace. That afternoon, I mentioned maybe going to the beach next weekend and watched Yolanda's face light up for the first time in so long. She immediately started planning, looking up restaurants on her phone, checking tide schedules, making a playlist for the drive. I told her she could pick everything: where we ate, what time we left, which beach we went to. She chose the one 2 hours south with the good fish tacos and the pier where you could watch surfers. She was excited about something future-focused instead of stuck in the past, talking about bringing her camera and maybe getting one of those big pretzels. We hadn't seen her this animated about anything in months. Wednesday morning, I stood at the kitchen window drinking coffee and watched Yolanda walk to the school with her friends. They were laughing about something on someone's phone, Yolanda right in the middle of the group instead of trailing behind. Her backpack bounced as she walked, her hands moving while she talked, looking like any other teenager heading to class. She'd been through hell and came out the other side different but not destroyed. She was careful now but not paranoid, quieter but not silent, changed but not broken. Watching her disappear around the corner with her friends, I thought about how I really would cut down every tree in this town to keep her safe. Thanks for hanging out and wondering through all of this with me. It's really been a journey worth sharing together. I'll catch you in the next one. Like the video, it helps more than you think.